Arben and Elira Krasniqi were just another Albanian family in London, but behind closed doors, they were building an empire that could have taken over America. What happened when loyalty cracked and betrayal exposed their secrets? The quiet streets of London's East End seemed ordinary, almost peaceful, but a storm was quietly approaching. A small Albanian family arrived in the city, blending seamlessly among the locals. On the surface, they looked like regular immigrants, hardworking, respectful, and almost invisible. Few could have guessed that behind their calm exterior lay a deep, calculated ambition. The father, a man known for his sharp mind and ruthless determination, had survived years of violence in the Balkans. His experiences had taught him that power came only to those willing to act decisively and without hesitation. The mother, equally cunning, managed the family's finances and maintained connections with distant relatives across Europe, subtly laying the groundwork for an empire. Their children, though young, were already being trained in loyalty, observation, and the art of influence. Nothing was left to chance. Every movement, every conversation, every action was calculated. As days turned into weeks, the family quietly observed the city's criminal underworld. They visited markets, clubs, and business centers, studying the existing networks. They watched rival gangs, noting their strengths and weaknesses, listening to whispers of disputes, debts, and betrayals. Every tiny detail mattered. The Albanians understood that brute force alone would not guarantee dominance. Information, timing, and the ability to manipulate alliances were far more powerful. They began building small connections, some through business deals, others through intimidation disguised as protection. London's street gangs did not notice the careful infiltration. The family was patient, knowing that the most dangerous threats were often invisible until they were fully formed. The first signs of their influence were subtle. Small businesses started paying fees for security that only the family could provide. Neighborhood disputes were quietly resolved in their favor. They never made noise, never left a trace of their hand in these events. Even local law enforcement barely noticed the early signs, dismissing them as minor street activity. Meanwhile, the family carefully documented every interaction, every favor, every rivalry. Each observation was stored mentally, every connection noted, ready to be used when the time came to expand. Their ambition was not reckless. It was strategic. They were not merely living in London. They were learning it, understanding it, mapping it, preparing for a move far larger than anyone could imagine. Within months, the family had created a network of minor allies and potential recruits. Young men with nothing to lose and much to gain were drawn into the orbit of influence. Loyalty was tested, fear was applied with subtlety, and respect was demanded without a word. The Albanians were planting seeds for an empire that would not remain confined to London or even Europe. In quiet homes and hidden warehouses, plans were whispered, connections strengthened, and methods perfected. Every minor victory, every unnoticed move, brought them closer to a goal that few could see, but they themselves understood clearly. The calm exterior of the city hid the storm building within, a storm that would one day reach across the Atlantic, threatening cities thousands of miles away. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the first chapter of a dangerous rise had quietly begun. As the Albanian family quietly established themselves in London, their focus shifted from observation to organization. They understood that power was not built overnight. It required structure, loyalty, and control. The father began recruiting carefully, choosing individuals who were ambitious but disciplined, those who would follow instructions without question and keep secrets that could cost lives. Each recruit was tested, sometimes with small tasks, other times through intense observation, to determine their reliability. Those who failed were quietly removed from the circle, disappearing without explanation. The family's reputation for both fairness and ruthlessness spread in hushed tones, attracting individuals who wanted protection, opportunity, or a share of the growing power. By the end of the first year, the Albanians had built a network that was invisible to outsiders but formidable in its reach. The mother, using her sharp mind for numbers and connections, began managing the finances, ensuring that every transaction, legal or illegal, went through controlled channels. She created a web of legitimate businesses, restaurants, car repair shops, small import-export companies that acted as fronts for the growing criminal activities. These businesses were perfect for laundering money, creating jobs for recruits, and maintaining a sense of normalcy. The children were slowly introduced to the system, learning to recognize threats and opportunities, trained in observation, negotiation, and the quiet but absolute authority that would define their family's empire. Even the smallest details, from who could be trusted to which streets were safest, were noted and remembered, preparing the next generation to continue the operation. The network began expanding beyond the immediate family. All eyes were recruited strategically, not just for manpower, but for information. Some were skilled in tracking shipments, others in surveillance, while a few were experts in intimidation and enforcement. Every member had a role, and discipline was strict. Mistakes were not tolerated, and betrayal meant instant elimination from the network. The Albanian method was simple. Loyalty was rewarded with protection and opportunity, disloyalty with swift consequences. Rumors of the family's power began to circulate, whispers that even hardened criminals in London's underworld found unsettling. The family's ability to remain invisible while exerting influence created an aura of fear and respect. By mid-year, the family's ambitions had grown larger. The plan was no longer limited to London. The father began making tentative connections across Europe and the Atlantic, seeking ways to expand into the U.S. Every interaction, from legal business trips to discreet meetings with other criminal figures, was calculated. Their influence in London became the training ground, the proving field for a larger empire. The lieutenants they had chosen were now trusted with small international operations, learning to move shipments and handle disputes without leaving evidence. Slowly but surely, the Albanian network was becoming more than just a family operation. It was evolving into a sophisticated, multi-layered criminal organization, capable of reaching beyond borders and striking where rivals least expected. The city remained unaware of the silent power growing among its streets. No alarms were raised, no headlines appeared. Yet behind closed doors in hidden offices and rented warehouses, the Albanian family prepared their next steps, tightening the bonds of loyalty, perfecting methods of control, and ensuring that when the time came to expand across the Atlantic, they would be ready. The network was no longer a small operation. It was a machine, disciplined, precise, and deadly, waiting for the moment to strike. By the end of their second year in London, the Albanian family was no longer content with local influence. Their sights had shifted across the Atlantic to the United States, a land of opportunity and risk. They knew that entering the U.S. criminal world would not be easy, but the family was patient, meticulous, and unafraid. Their first moves were subtle, almost invisible. A few carefully chosen shipments of contraband drugs, rare goods, and forged documents were sent through discreet channels, bypassing ports and customs under the cover of legitimate import businesses. Each shipment was a test, measuring the strength of the connections they had established and the reliability of their chosen associates abroad. Small successes built confidence, and the family began to understand complexities of international operations, from legal loopholes to the vulnerabilities of local enforcement agencies. To strengthen their position, they began forming alliances with minor street gangs in key U.S. cities. They offered protection, information, and access to European heroin, creating a mutually beneficial network. Local gangs initially hesitated, wary of foreigners trying to influence their territory. But the Albanians' reputation for discipline, secrecy, and deadly efficiency quickly earned them respect. The family sent trusted lieutenants to the U.S., young men trained in observation, negotiation and enforcement, who quietly embedded themselves within the city streets. They studied rival gangs, noted weaknesses, and mapped out strategic territories that would later become vital hubs for their operations. Each step was calculated, measured, and executed with precision. Back in London, the family maintained the illusion of normal life. Businesses continued to operate, children attended school, and neighbors saw nothing unusual. Yet behind the scenes, coordination was constant. Every move across the Atlantic was monitored, every communication encrypted and hidden from authorities. Financial trails were disguised through multiple front companies, offshore accounts, and legal investments, making it nearly impossible for outsiders to track the growing empire. Even small mistakes could lead to exposure, and the family treated every operation as a potential life or death test. Trust was their most valuable currency, and betrayal was dealt with swiftly and permanently. The U.S. operations gradually expanded beyond the initial shipments and alliances. The Albanians began influencing nightlife, small businesses, and street-level distribution of drugs. They provided security to clubs and events, using their reputation for discipline and violence to enforce authority. Slowly, they were testing their power, seeing how far they could push without drawing unwanted attention. Local law enforcement noticed patterns, but could not connect them to the European family at the center. The Albanians' ability to remain in the shadows while expanding influence was remarkable, demonstrating their understanding of both human nature and the mechanics of organized crime. By the time the family had fully established their foothold, they had created a bridge between Europe and America, a network that moved resources, personnel, and information seamlessly across continents. Each success emboldened them, but it also increased risk. The higher they climbed, the more they attracted attention from law enforcement and rival gangs alike. Despite the danger, the family remained confident, believing that their discipline, loyalty, and calculated strategy would allow them to succeed where others had failed. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every plan, every relationship, and every secret the Albanian family had worked so hard to protect. The empire they were building across the Atlantic was fragile yet formidable, and the next moves would determine whether it would rise or crumble. While the family's operations in the United States were still in their infancy, London had become the center of their power and influence. They had extended their reach far beyond the initial neighborhood, quietly controlling clubs, bars, and luxury car dealerships, all under the guise of legitimate business. These establishments were not only profitable, but also strategic, acting as hubs for laundering money, recruiting allies, and observing rivals. Wealth flowed in through front businesses, hidden accounts, and clever investments, creating a layer of protection that masked the true extent of their empire. Patrons of these venues rarely realized the danger surrounding them, and city officials and law enforcement continued to see the family as ordinary business owners, completely unaware of the international criminal network growing under their noses. The mother was the master of financial strategy, ensuring that every pound could be traced, laundered, or invested to avoid suspicion. She maintained connections with European associates, creating a web of transactions that spanned countries, making it nearly impossible for authorities to follow the trail. Even minor businesses contributed to a network of wealth that strengthened the family's influence, and every deal reinforced loyalty within the organization. The family's power was built on precision. Nothing was impulsive, and every financial move had a purpose. Meanwhile, the children were becoming adept at recognizing threats, learning to observe body language, and understanding who could be trusted and who might be a risk. This early training ensured that the next generation would be ready to continue the family's secretive mission. Despite the careful planning, cracks in the operation began to appear. A local journalist noticed inconsistencies in the sudden wealth appearing around certain areas and began connecting the dots between missing shipments, unexpected business expansions, and unusual activity in nightlife establishments. Although the journalist had no direct evidence of crime, the pattern of influence and the family's discreet but firm control over their surroundings raised suspicion. The Albanians had built a wall of secrecy, but the smallest observation threatened to expose them. They began adjusting, increasing security, limiting communication, and monitoring both employees and outsiders more carefully. Every meeting, shipment, and transaction was scrutinized, reinforcing the family's paranoia and control. The British connection also allowed the family to test strategies that would later be applied to the United States. Nightclubs and casinos became training grounds for their recruits, teaching them how to handle confrontation, enforce rules, and manage illegal activity under the cover of legitimate business. These hubs also provided a way to observe law enforcement tactics, studying how police monitored nightlife and business transactions, and learning how to avoid detection. The Albanians operated in the shadows, blending legality with criminal intent, creating a complex system that was difficult to penetrate. Each member of the family and the extended network had a role, and discipline was absolute. Any deviation from the plan was met with swift consequences. By the end of this phase, the family's empire in London was powerful and growing, and their reach into America was slowly solidifying. The walls of secrecy were strong, but the tiniest crack could lead to disaster. They had become masters of disguise, financial manipulation, and controlled influence. The city itself became a stage, their operations a carefully orchestrated performance, and the family the invisible rulers behind it. What remained unknown was how long they could maintain this balance, because the higher they climbed, the more attention they attracted from journalists, law enforcement, and rival gangs, all waiting for a moment when the empire would show its true vulnerability. Even the most disciplined empires have vulnerabilities, and for the Albanian family, the first crack came from within. One of the father's most trusted lieutenants, a man who had proven his loyalty in countless operations, began to feel overlooked and underappreciated. He had managed several high-risk shipments to the United States and coordinated crucial alliances with minor street gangs. Yet his contributions were never publicly recognized. In the silent, calculated world of the family, personal ambition could be dangerous, and resentment quietly built like a storm cloud. The lieutenant started noticing weaknesses in the family's operations and quietly documented them, creating a record of methods, contacts, and financial routes. His mind, sharp and methodical, began considering opportunities outside the family's control, a decision that could unravel years of planning in an instant. At first, he acted cautiously, sending anonymous tips and small pieces of information to law enforcement and journalists, testing how much impact it could have. The family's empire was vast, and the walls of secrecy were designed to prevent exactly this kind of exposure. But the lieutenant's knowledge was precise. He knew which shipments were critical, which businesses were laundering the most money, and which associates could be persuaded to cooperate with authorities. Each time a tip reached the proper channels, the authorities quietly began monitoring without alerting the family. The Albanians had grown confident, perhaps too confident, believing that their combination of discipline, loyalty, and fear made them untouchable. This overconfidence would soon be exploited, proving that no empire, no matter how well constructed, is immune to betrayal. As weeks passed, the tips increased in detail and accuracy. Investigators across London and the United States began to connect dots that had previously seemed unrelated. Shipments were intercepted, bank accounts monitored, and surveillance intensified. For the first time, the Albanian family sensed that someone outside or even inside was aware of their operations. The father, usually calm and calculating, became alert, studying patterns that had gone unnoticed before. Meetings were shortened, communication became encrypted, and trusted lieutenants were carefully re-evaluated. The mother, ever meticulous with finances, began tracing the sources of small disruptions, suspecting that a leak existed within the network. Yet even with heightened vigilance, the damage had already begun. the lieutenant's actions had ripple effects. Minor members of the network started questioning the family's methods, unsure whom to trust. Tension rose quietly but steadily. The once loyal network became strained, with fear now mingling with uncertainty. The Albania's ability to operate silently across borders was compromised, and what had once seemed like invincible planning began showing signs of fragility. The U.S. operations, still in early stages, were now under careful observation by authorities who had previously had no concrete leads. Every shipment, every alliance, every transaction was scrutinized with precision, leaving less room for error and increasing the risk of exposure. Despite the looming threat, the family tried to maintain its control and order. Strict discipline continued, loyalty was tested, and every member was reminded of the consequences of failure. However, the seeds of betrayal had already taken root, proving that even the most meticulously constructed criminal empire could be undone by human ambition. The empire they had built with patience, strategy, and ruthlessness was now facing a danger that could not be solved with fear or money alone. A single act of disloyalty had set in motion a chain reaction that would soon expose the network, challenge the family's authority, and bring international attention to the empire they had so carefully constructed. The empire the Albanian family had built across London and the United States was beginning to show cracks, and authorities were now ready to act. Months of careful surveillance, combined with the inside information provided by the disloyal lieutenant, had allowed law enforcement to map the entire network. Investigators coordinated across borders, connecting financial transactions, intercepted shipments, and covert observations into a clear picture of the family's operations. What had once seemed like an invisible empire of shadows was now a target. Police in both countries waited for the perfect moment to strike, knowing that rushing could allow the family to vanish, taking their wealth and influence with them. Patience had always been a strength of the Albanian family, but it was now being used against them. The first arrests came quietly. Key lieutenants in London were apprehended during routine checks, their homes searched, and their assets frozen. Simultaneously, U.S. authorities intercepted shipments of contraband, revealing hidden routes that had gone unnoticed for years. Each capture and seizure provided more information, unraveling the web of connections the family had so carefully constructed. Even the father, usually unshakable, began to sense the pressure. He intensified security measures, restricted communication, and attempted to reorganize operations, but every move was anticipated by law enforcement. The family's control, once absolute, was now slipping through their fingers. Behind the scenes, law enforcement used the family's own strategies against them. Surveillance methods mirrored the Albania's careful observation techniques. Every safe house, front business, and financial transaction was tracked. Analysts predicted movements, anticipated attempts to relocate assets, and monitored associates for signs of compliance or betrayal. The very discipline that had made the family powerful was now being exploited. Trusted members were questioned quietly, and small mistakes led to arrests and evidence gathering. One by one, the empire's pillars began to crumble under the weight of coordinated international investigation. Despite the escalating pressure, the family attempted to fight back. Messengers were sent, shipments rerouted, and local allies in the U.S. were called upon to protect operations. Yet the network had already been penetrated. The combination of internal betrayal and law enforcement precision made counteraction nearly impossible. Panic began to spread among the lower ranks. Members who had once felt untouchable suddenly found themselves under investigation, with fear replacing loyalty. The Albania's reputation for invincibility, carefully cultivated over years of calculated moves, was now being questioned by those who had once followed them unquestioningly. As arrests continued, the scale of exposure became apparent. Newspapers began reporting unexplained raids, international investigations, and the sudden disappearance of key figures from London and American cities. Public curiosity soared, and the shadow empire that had operated unnoticed for years was suddenly under intense scrutiny. The father and mother, realizing that the empire they had spent decades constructing was unraveling, went into hiding. Assets were frozen, businesses investigated, and the network's influence waned. The carefully constructed facade of control, secrecy, and power could no longer withstand the coordinated strikes. By the end of this phase, the Albanian family's empire, once feared and untouchable, had been shattered. Operations across London and the United States were dismantled, shipments halted, and key members in custody. What remained was a trail of exposed secrets, ruined alliances, and a cautionary tale for those who believed that loyalty, fear, and discipline could guarantee invincibility. The empire that had quietly grown from a small family operation into a transatlantic criminal network was now in ruins, proving that no matter how powerful even the most meticulously planned empire can be destroyed when betrayal and law enforcement collide. Once the arrests and interceptions had begun, the Albanian family's shadow empire could no longer remain hidden. Media outlets in both London and the United States started reporting on unusual patterns in businesses, unexplained wealth, and sudden law enforcement raids. Journalists pieced together fragments of information, slowly revealing the scope of the family's international operations. Stories of luxury cars, high-end nightclubs, and discreet shipments of contraband captured public attention, while the calculated violence and discipline of the family's organization added a chilling layer to the narrative. For the first time, ordinary citizens began to grasp just how far the Albanian Mafia had reached, and the empire that had operated silently for years was now fully exposed to the world. Authorities presented evidence to the media carefully, ensuring that the criminal network's operations were clear but also dramatic. Details emerged of human trafficking, drug smuggling, and complex money laundering schemes spanning continents. Witnesses who had once feared retaliation began to speak under protection programs, describing the extreme measures used to maintain control. The reports painted a picture of a network that had combined discipline, fear, and strategic intelligence to operate in multiple countries simultaneously. The public was shocked to learn that a family, seemingly ordinary in appearance, had managed to challenge established criminal organizations and infiltrate legal businesses with such precision. The exposure had immediate effects on remaining associates. Many fled, abandoning properties, businesses, and shipments. Others attempted to hide, but the combination of media scrutiny and law enforcement pressure made it impossible to continue operations. Local gangs who had once collaborated with the Albanian family now distanced themselves, fearing prosecution and unwanted attention. The network that had thrived in secrecy for years crumbled almost overnight, leaving behind a landscape of fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. Rival criminal groups, previously cautious, now saw opportunities to reclaim territories and assets that had once been under the family's control. As the story unfolded, the Albanian family's meticulous planning and discipline were widely discussed by crime experts and analysts. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials examined the methods they had used to recruit, enforce loyalty, and maintain secrecy. Analysts highlighted the family's ability to exploit both legal and illegal channels simultaneously, demonstrating how ambition combined with intelligence can allow relatively small groups to build influence quickly. Yet the analysts also pointed out the vulnerabilities, the reliance on loyalty, the danger of internal betrayal, and the risks of overconfidence, which had ultimately led to the empire's downfall. The story became a cautionary tale, a stark warning that no matter how careful or powerful a criminal organization might appear, it is never invincible. By the end of this period, the Albanian Mafia's reach had been revealed to the public, and the family's identity and methods were now widely known. The shock of the exposure sent ripples across the criminal world, law enforcement agencies, and even ordinary citizens who had once ignored the subtle changes in their neighborhoods. The empire had been powerful, well-organized, and ruthless, but its secrecy had been compromised, proving that even the most disciplined operations are vulnerable to betrayal, observation, and public scrutiny. What remained was a mixture of fascination, fear, and a lesson that criminal ambition, no matter how disciplined, cannot survive unchecked forever. Months after the exposure of the Albanian Mafia, the streets of London and American cities had returned to a tense, uneasy calm. Businesses that had once been under the family's control slowly reopened under new ownership, but the memory of fear and influence lingered. Authorities worked tirelessly to dismantle remaining cells, arresting associates who had attempted to escape or hide. Surveillance continued on key figures, ensuring that any attempt to rebuild the network would be detected immediately. The empire that had once spanned continents and challenged established criminal organizations had been reduced to scattered fragments, its leaders either imprisoned, in hiding, or under investigation. Despite the apparent quiet, the shadow of their ambition remained, a reminder of how quickly organized crime could grow and how dangerous it could become before exposure. The family itself had vanished from public view. The father and mother, once the pillars of a carefully constructed empire, had retreated into hiding, their freedom limited by constant surveillance and international warrants. The children, trained from a young age in observation and discipline, had seen the fragility of even the most meticulous plans. They now understood that loyalty alone could not protect against betrayal or scrutiny. Every member of the family had learned the high cost of ambition and secrecy, and the empire they had worked so hard to build was now a lesson in vulnerability. The world had seen the consequences of unchecked ambition, and the Albanian Mafia's collapse became a case study in both criminal ingenuity and inevitable downfall. The story of the family and their empire quickly became a cautionary tale among crime experts, law enforcement, and even ordinary citizens. Analysts discussed how the Albanians had combined strategy, loyalty, fear, and intelligence to create a transatlantic criminal network, and how a single act of betrayal could bring down a seemingly invincible organization. The meticulous planning, discipline, and courage that had allowed them to rise so quickly were now contrasted with the weaknesses that had led to their exposure. For law enforcement, the case highlighted the importance of patience, observation, and international cooperation in combating organized crime. For the public, it was a reminder that criminal influence can grow silently, often unnoticed, until it is too large to ignore. Even as the empire crumbled, the Albanian Mafia left behind a legacy of lessons. Rival gangs learned to be cautious, to anticipate betrayal, and to respect networks that combined secrecy with intelligence. Authorities reviewed the case repeatedly, analyzing what had worked and what could have been improved. Cities adjusted policies, strengthened monitoring of businesses linked to organized crime, and remained vigilant against similar attempts. The story of the Albanian family had become part of the criminal history of both Europe and the United States, a narrative of ambition, secrecy, and ultimate downfall. In the end, the Albanian Mafia's attempt to conquer America and expand globally failed, but the impact of their operations was undeniable. Their rise and fall demonstrated the power of discipline and strategy, but also the inevitability of exposure when human greed, betrayal, and law enforcement converge. The empire they dreamed of never materialized, yet the echoes of their ambition lingered, leaving a chilling lesson for those who dare to build in the shadows. The world had witnessed the rise of a shadow empire and its ultimate collapse, a story that would remain in memory as a stark reminder of how quickly power can shift and how fragile even the most formidable plans truly are.